All right. So, hello everyone, and we are starting a new book. We're not going to spend too long unless you all hear what I have to say and you want to go slower, we can do that. But today, let's talk about Deuteronomy. I have hinted at before that Deuteronomy kind of does its own thing, has its own perspective, and so I put together a small PowerPoint to explain why. So before I dive into the PowerPoint, do you all have any initial thoughts or initial questions about this book? I told you just to read a little bit of the beginning, just to kind of get your feet wet, get a little bit of the feel. Any questions before I jump into the PowerPoint?
No, it does sound, well, the introduction with the commentary was, the writing was so small, it took me a long time to read it. But it sounds like it's written by totally different people. The voice is very different.
Exactly. So with that in mind, let's jump in. All right. So, let's make sure my controls work. There we go. So just quick facts real quick. So Deuteronomy, of course, is the fifth book of the Torah. The other word that I'm going to be using in this is Pentateuch, which is the technical name for the first 5 books of the Bible. And you'll see why, because the word Torah gets used a few different ways when it comes to Deuteronomy. The word that we use that is Deuteronomy comes from the Greek, of course, because I think it's good to know that the Christian translations come through Greek and through Latin, so we tend to use the names that the people who spoke Latin gave to it. So the Greek version, Deuter and then Nomos, is literally the second law, and that kind of hints at the repetitive nature of Deuteronomy and that it covers a lot of things that have already been covered. In Hebrew, the book is just the first line of Deuteronomy. These are the words that Moses spoke to all of Israel, and so they call it, these are the words, or Ela ha-davrim, or they shorten it to just davrim, the words, basically. And so this is the book. This is really the only book that is explicitly said to be written by Moses himself. The other ones are kind of implied to be written by Moses, but this one is very explicit and repetitive that Moses wrote this. And this comes from the commentary in the HarperCollins. In short, this authoritative Torah law is the virtual surrogate for Moses himself as the preeminent mediator for the divine word of Israel. So I'm going to pause with that last statement of thinking about this as kind of like both the second law, these are the words of Moses, but kind of having Moses's words as a surrogate for himself, because he's not going into the promised land, but his words do. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts about that. No? Okay.
Well, I know it was written much later, started and then finished during the exile, or around that time. So, that's why the language is so different. So it's very unlikely that Moses wrote it, but they do really want Moses to be an important figure. So
yes, Moses, yes, I mean, yeah. So Moses is central in this book, specifically because it's basically 3 sermons and a few things at the end. And the 3 sermons are in Moses's point of view, where in the rest of these stories, we kind of have this hovering narrator view that talks a little bit from God's point of view and then talks a little bit from Moses's point of view, but it's kind of that omniscient third person, where these are the words of Moses. These are 3 sermons. The first sermon is recounting of the 40 years of wandering. This is and it's exhortations to observe the law. So this is kind of looking backwards, remembering what happened. The second sermon is the reminder that Israelites that they need to follow God, and these are the laws that God has given them in order to keep possession of the land. So these are all the the good part, like please do this, do this, do this. Remember, this is what you agree to. Here's the law, and the carrot at the end of the stick is that they get to keep the land. However, the third sermon is basically what happens if you don't. If you don't follow the law and if you don't keep the commandments, well, if you are unfaithful, you will lose the land. But, and there's a big but here, and this is why it's seen as comforting, not just like threats and doom and gloom. The caveat is given that with repentance, the land will be restored to the people. So it gives them a way to repossess the land. And so the ending, though, has these little bits. There's the Song of Moses. There's the blessings of Moses. There's the narrative, again, of Moses passing leadership to Joshua. And then there's the narrative of Moses, like, going up the mountain to pass away on it. And this is why it gets a little bit funny that this book is supposed to be written by Moses, is because Moses would have then had to write about what he was about to do of go up the mountain and die, but we won't poke too much at that. So the bulk of Deuteronomy are these 3 sermons. The purpose of it is kind of Moses working as legislator. It's seen, if you take the view of the book itself, he's basically adding extra stuff in. He's completing the work of the revelation and the covenantal law that began at Mount Horeb. So it's seen as kind of an addendum, an addition, reminders. Some laws are tweaked and changed. Some things are like fleshed out a little bit more. But there are additional things that aren't mentioned in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. There are some new things that you only find in Deuteronomy. But the way that this is often looked at is because Deuteronomy kind of changes things a bit. They tweak things, the author kind of, you see how they change and interpret what's happened before. It's often seen as the, quote, interpretive key to understanding the rest of the 5 books. So basically, Deuteronomy has a different perspective, but they use this perspective to kind of look at the other books to understand them. And so that viewpoint, once again, coming from the commentary, is it is understood that the whole perspective of the abiding revelation of God's will for the ongoing life of the covenant people. So this is where the perspective of all of these books have been this ongoing narrative of God being with the people and God choosing a people and God kind of being with the people, and these are the chosen people meant to be in this land. This is kind of retroactively read into the rest of the 5 books, or in the other 4 books. So kind of any questions there? Are we good?
Good.
So before we talk about the dating, we do need to talk about what's called the Deuteronomistic historian. The also known as the Nevi'im is the Nevi'im are a collection known as the prophets. These are not the prophets that we think of when we're like Isaiah or Joshua. That's a different collection. What we often think of the next few books is kind of more of the history. So this includes like Joshua and Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd King. These are the, quote, old prophets. And the next few books detail kind of how they go from like these wandering tribe in the desert to establishing a kingdom, or well, having like the tribal collection of city-states to then kingdom, and then the dual kingdoms of the north and the south. So Joshua is basically how they conquer the land. Judges is that like city-state thing where it's like the Philistines will come and then the tribes band together and they push off the enemy, but then they kind of go into like the city-states. 1st and 2nd Samuel is the prophet Samuel. So 1st Samuel talks about King Saul, and then 2 Samuel, or David becomes a character in 1 Samuel, but 2 Samuel is more about David's reign as king and into King Solomon, where 1 and 2 Kings are the descendants of King Solomon, and that's where the kingdom very quickly in 1 and 2 Kings, that's when the kingdom splits into two, and the perspective jumps back and forth between the two kingdoms of Judah and Israel, but 1 and 2 King ends with the destruction of Israel. So that brings you up into the Babylonian exile, 1 and 2 Kings.
Why did they split? Like,
why did they split? Politics.
yeah. Oh, politics. Okay.
You have a collection of people who all think they should rule, and if I can't rule the whole thing, I'll rule half of it.
Okay.
And so the thought is that Deuteronomy actually belonged originally in this grouping of books. That Deuteronomy was the introduction, which is why there's a lot of recap of what happened in the previous 4 books. It's that you recap it, and then you explain. If you take Deuteronomy through 2 Kings, you have Moses's warnings of what to do if you're faithful, or like how to be faithful and what happens if you don't. And by the end of 2 Kings, you have the explanation of they weren't faithful, and this is what happens. So this is the tone, the language, the kind of writing style is very similar throughout these books. It doesn't mean they were all written by the same person. It may be that there was an editor that put them all together. But at some point in history, Deuteronomy kind of got broken off and attached to and this is where the term the Pentateuch becomes more helpful, because Deuteronomy in and of itself, they talk about the Torah because that just means the law. So the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, Deuteronomy kind of gets broken off and attached to that instead of the group of books it was likely written alongside. The Deuteronomistic historian is the person who is seen to put all of these together. The interesting part about all of this is, remember talking about all of the sources back in Genesis, that we had the northern source, we had the southern source, we had the priestly source, and there was the Deuteronomistic historian. That was the 4th source, and I didn't really touch on it because it's kind of difficult to understand. But in the compilation, you can see the person who put Deuteronomy in these other books. They kind of have their fingerprints on some of the former books where they edited it, and it is kind of seen that the Deuteronomistic historian was the final editor of the whole bunch of books. So it comes later on, but they do seem to have an control over the entire narrative. And the Deuteronomistic historian does have a narrative and does have a purpose and has a very specific way of reading these texts, and so may have worked with some of the things that predate them to kind of make the narrative a little more seamless in their opinion, but kind of go to the same point, or actually have the same point all along the story. So dating Deuteronomy, I didn't get as much detail about this. I wanted to actually look into this a little bit more than I had time to, but there does seem to be older parts of Deuteronomy. Once again, you can often tell by language. I mean, when we talk about this, you can, by using slang, you can date today's slang versus slang in the 1960s versus how people talk in the 1900s. It's the same thing where you can tell more archaic phrasings. So it does seem to be that there are older parts of it. But they think the bulk of it was written between the fall of Samaria, which is the northern kingdom. So the northern kingdom of Israel falls first, which in 1720 BCE, that would be to the Assyrian Empire. And then between that, the fall of the north, and then the fall of the south to Babylon. So Babylon conquers Assyria and then conquers all of this area. And so this is where they think the bulk of Deuteronomy was put together, is basically the North fell and people were panicking. And eventually the South also fell, but they think most of the narrative was already put together by then. There is one line of logic that thinks that in the book of 2 Kings, specifically 2 Kings 22, there is a very young king that comes to power, and there's some priests cleaning out the back room of the temple, and they find the Torah, the book of the law, and they're freaking out because all of a sudden they have this and it says read it every year. We talked about this before with like the celebration of the Passover, and there's a point where they find it and they go, oh no, we found the law and we haven't been following it. And so they bring it out and they read it before the people. They think that part of that may have been like the book of Deuteronomy, and they have like a chunk of it and then they filled in the gaps before it and after it. So like the middle section they think might be a little bit older and might be part of what they found in the story of 2 Kings. So that said, who is it written by? There's a chance that like royal scribes, basically the person who's writing down what the king says and all the laws that the king is putting out, or prophets, the people who were kind of advisors but also like spiritual intermediaries, or tribal elders. Basically the tribe still exists, so leaders of the tribe would come and have input, but most likely the Levitical priests were the ones writing this. So it is different than the priestly source, likely because of a different time frame, but because once again they're thinking about decision making, they're thinking of instructions, they're thinking about how to worship, they're dealing with this on a more regular basis. They do think it was fleshed out by the priestly group of the Levitical priest, basically. So that is our very fast introduction to Deuteronomy, where like Genesis and Exodus, or specifically Genesis, has some very ancient pieces to it. We know that the Exodus narrative has an older piece to it, and it was the interesting part is those were like, we talked about how those stories are old but likely written down during the time of the kings, and then it was all put together in exile. They think that Deuteronomy was written more by the later kings, and then the historian who's compiling all of the person who wrote Deuteronomy, or the people who did, were the final compilers, likely the ones in exile. And that's why you get this look. It's not just the like, yay, we're about to set up a kingdom. It's they write it very much with the knowledge that, yay, we have a kingdom, but it's also falling. This is more of like written during a time where it feels like the end is near, and they're kind of trying to make sense of how could the end be near. So less of an origin story, it's more that it's looking at the origin story and looking at what they see as the future, or the reality that happened. So what do you all think of this different perspective? Does it make sense? Do you get how this one is different and kind of what it's doing?
Yeah. One of the things that it mentioned in my introduction was that the laws they're trying to bring things more up to date in order to appeal to a different time, so that they are modified, but I don't know how they're modified. I'm curious about that, but
Yeah.
the way we don't do with the Constitution. But the Constitution is supposed to be a living document. They're saying the same thing about the Torah, that they're trying to go to different times.
Yeah. So, I mean, we often think about like ancient people, it's like, well, they don't have technology. What do they have to update? But even in the books, the transfer from Joshua to Judges to the kingdoms, to the bifurcated kingdoms, you have 4 different society structures, and there are innovations in there. And as we've talked about last time, that like these are nomadic people going from being like a nomadic group in the wilderness to becoming agriculturalists to becoming having urban centers. And so the law that they have isn't necessarily tooled to be around a city as Jerusalem becomes and Samaria becomes. These become decently big urban centers. And so it's like, how do you deal with, or like the difference between people might live together in a village, but everyone kind of has the farmland. And so everyone's still mostly agricultural, to building up enough that you have urbanites who have never farmed in their life. So how do you do things like sacrifices? How do you sacrifice a goat if you have no access to goat herds? And so those are kind of the changes as they urbanize a little bit more, not necessarily industrial revolution level, but they're still like society is changing. And it's basically as their cities become more established, more developed, bigger, they have different problems. And so, yeah, when they find it in the temple, they're like, some of these seem like from when we were just a bunch of people, probably not the wandering state, but more of the like the loose bands of 12 groups that kind of band together. You need to update some of it from that.
So when they just went from saying that you could sacrifice any old place in the wilderness, now you have to do it in Jerusalem. Where do they get their animals? Do they go out in the, well, they must get, there's some people that they go out in the country and get somebody who has a flock of sheep or something, or they do less sacrificing, or what?
So that is where you get the money changers in the temple.
Oh,
We think of it as like this because Jesus flips the table of the money changers, and we're like, yeah, there shouldn't be business in this place of worship. It was actually a functional thing that, like, if you grew grain and needed a goat for sacrifice, you could change your grain into money so you could then buy a goat for the goat sellers. Or if you had goats and you needed a pigeon, you could make the exchange. The exchange tables were actually to make sure that everyone had the proper sacrifice when most people didn't have everything. So that's not actually ever put into like scripture that that's how they did it, but that's a functional change that needed to happen. So the money changers it was, yes, a temple tax, but it was also making sure people had the sacrifices they needed when they were specialized. If you were the person who was the blacksmith, yeah, you don't have a cow to sacrifice, but you may need a cow. So how do you go from your wares blacksmithing to animals? But around the city, so Jerusalem has a city wall. And most of the people lived inside the city wall, but your agriculturalist would live outside of the walls. So you would, like, if you owned sheep, you would likely hire a shepherd to stay outside the city walls with the sheep while you were safe inside the walls. Because if the enemy comes, you want to be inside the walls. What's really cool is if you've heard the archaeological dig about the city of David, they found basically the layer in which they think that King David lived in and around, and they've done some really cool digging. And it's really cool because you see that they built the wall around an aquifer. So if they were under siege, they still had water, which is very important. So other thoughts and questions? Yeah, Gary.
Just from the broadest viewpoint, we have all these stories that are recounted, many times repeated by, I don't know how many different individuals over centuries. I keep thinking that there must have been some central point where at some point these things start being put together. And that, I guess I'm just getting Do you have anything you could add to that? Help me get this behind me.
Yeah. So there's two things to keep in mind, and they've done research. First part, they done research, and I find it really amazing. They looked at a human's ability to memorize things and how accurate they are at memorization. And what they find is your memory is much more accurate in its memorization when you cannot read. The moment you learn to read, our accuracy of memorization goes down dramatically. Because
Wow.
basically your brain learns that it doesn't have to store the details because it can refer to the details. We see this also in how children are learning differently. Children aren't learning detailed facts. They are learning how to access them on the computer. So basically, they don't have to keep it in their brain because they can look it up. And so it's interesting how technology changes how our brains work. So in an illiterate society, they are better at memorizing. And they've done this by taking people who were basically tribal people who like didn't had no functional writing system, and then they taught them to read, and they did brain scans on either side. And what they show is that like even in a lifetime, when you learn to read, your memorization skills go down. So that is why there's looking in the record of something that was an oral tradition. If it was an oral tradition without writing, it is considered in some ways more accurate. Like it's semi-trustworthy. I won't say it's identical because we do see how narratives tend to diverge, but it is to say that, yeah, these stories are told over and over again, but there is a level of accuracy that we today will never experience and understand because we can all read. And so the question becomes, why does it go from being memorized to being written down? And that seems to be when there's a threat of it being lost. Because if humans are dying, then they are no longer able to repeat the story. And so when armies are coming, when there is an actual threat of invasion, when there is a part of your, like when you're basically your cousins in the Northern Kingdom are now no longer here, that's when fear takes hold, and all of a sudden you're like, I need to do something so it doesn't rely on me being alive. And that's why they think this begins to be written down, is because that threat becomes real. It's not I mean, it's interesting how the Dead Sea Scrolls are not dissimilar. The Dead Sea Scrolls were written down by a community that felt threatened, and they hid them because they were scared. And they did, like, there's a lot of questions around the community that wrote all these scrolls down because they are not alive to tell us or to repeat their stories. They did get eliminated. And what we have is the scrolls that they hid in the desert. So we have pieces of their community that outlasted them. And so these stories are being written down by people who are afraid that their tradition will go away. And so they start getting written down during the king, or like the first stories get written down as kind of your national story. But this part of the story is getting written down because they're scared. And then when the worst thing does happen, they do have they experience a conquering army that wins. They then are taking these stories that they have, and maybe they didn't get to memorize it, but they have their parents' scroll, and then they have their grandparents' scroll. When that generation passes away, then that's when they are starting to look at this and make sense of it. And that's when you get more of the editorializing, is by people who maybe didn't hear the oral tradition, but they have the scroll. And they're trying to piece it together. And so that's kind of where you get the various stories being stitched together, is people trying to make sense of it. And it's like, thank goodness they wrote it down, because now we can put it together again. So they may have seen it as, we have these fragments, and the parents aren't here to tell us how to put it together, so they put it together to the best of their ability, not really realizing they actually were combining things that weren't meant to be combined. So now we're going through history and we're paying attention to where the, like, dude, biblical historians are like some of the most nitpicky people. They're like, this word is used this many times and then it stops being used here, and this is how we know that these are different stories. It's ridiculous. There is, like, the fine-tooth comb that some of these historians go through is ridiculous. But these are people who desperately want to hold on to their stories, and the question is how. So does that make it a little bit more, does that help, Gary, in kind of thinking about this?
Yeah, you revealed some things I hadn't thought of. That was
Yeah, like what?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
It's
And
amazing they didn't notice that they were repeating themselves so much when they were editing. You know how there's so much repetition? And they keep
that's not,
telling you, what?
repetition's not a bad thing to them.
Oh, okay, okay.
I mean, I don't know about you, but I love when the same song comes on the radio again and I know it well enough I can sing along to it as I'm driving.
True.
Because once again, like, the people editing this can read. The high class people can read, but the people listening likely can't. So if it's repetitious, then you remember it.
Right.
So some of these things are making sure that the people listening can remember it.
Okay.
But isn't it possible that the authors of some of these books were not privy to all the other books, so that they knew that they didn't know they were repeating themselves?
So that's the interesting question when it comes to the laws of Deuteronomy, because I mean, that is that's just something we don't fully know, and maybe someone who has researched it more than me would know, because, like, Deuteronomy goes through the 10 commandments again, but they're not the same. That's the weird part. It's like they're listed again and they're siblings but not twins. And there's a lot of things in Deuteronomy where they're siblings, they're brothers, they're not identical. And the question is always why. And that's one way to explain it, is that, yeah, it's not like they had Leviticus sitting right here and they were copying verbatim and messed up, but are they trying to do it, or do they know Leviticus and are doing it from memory? Or did the stories just kind of diverge and then they were written down by different groups of people at different times? At some point they get put together, but by the time they get put together, they have differentiated enough that they are different. It kind of like, the thing that it kind of makes me think of is the stories that you read about in the newspaper of, like, identical twins separated at birth, have the same job, and married a woman with the same name, and, like, their lives are, like, parallel, but they're still not identical. And that's maybe what you could kind of think of as the story at some point gets diverged and they take a similar path, but it's not a one-to-one. So it is clear that they got separated at some point.
Wait, yeah, that's the identical twin studies are interesting, because one of the things they know is that if they're separated, twins that are separated are more alike than twins that grow up together, because twins that grow up together specialize and they get labeled, like she's the smart one, she's the one, you know, that kind of thing. Is that I just think that's really interesting. That because they have those really there was I think it was I don't know, there were two boys that were, one of them was switched at the hospital or something like that, and they ended up being so much alike. It was amazing.
Life is weird. So, any other thoughts for the introduction, or do we want to spend a little time actually talking about what you all read? I will admit I spent enough time putting the PowerPoint together. I didn't actually get to read the introduction of Deuteronomy, but I also know it enough to know that it's mostly recap. I had you all read the recap from the first portion, and I'm just curious of your all's thoughts of kind of this introduction here.
Is this chapter 1?
Yeah, I said loosely read a little bit from anywhere from chapter 1 to chapter 4. That's the first sermon is 1 to 4 that's that first chunk, and it's the recap of what happened. Or is it basically, oh, that's just recap?
Yeah,
Okay. Yeah, Mary Ellen?
Well, my reaction to it was another summary or another recap, but yet I'm okay with that because right now I learn through repetition. And so the constant reminder of different events and what happened in what sequence, kind of a synopsis of the whole story, but it helps me understand it when it's repeated and when it's condensed and it's sequential.
Mm-hmm.
And there didn't seem to be any great disagreements between what this summary indicated had happened and at least my recall of what happened when we read it initially. It's sort of nice. It condensed it all into one's quick narrative, but it told the same, in essence, it told the same story.
Mm-hmm.
it didn't mention, well, I only read the chapter, but it doesn't, they sinned against the Lord, but when they don't go into Israel, but they don't, didn't God kill a lot of people when they didn't go in? Yeah, is that not there?
Yeah.
There's less killing.
There's less killing. Yeah,
A lot of it.
yeah. Yahweh was really.
Mm-hmm.
But this all kind of smoothed out and palatable. You just
Yeah.
kind of
Picking up
run
that.
through the whole thing, like incidentally, we wiped them out.
Yeah.
Read, it seems like a more modern kind of, language.
Mm-hmm. And that's the thing, the language, and that's, if you can tell the language sounds more modern, it's because their linguistics had changed by this point. So you can very much, if you can hear the difference, there's a reason. They think that there's about 700 years between when the stories in like Genesis, where they think the original versions start to date, that's like not in its current form, but in its original, like around the campfire story. They think it's about 700 years of linguistic change. And so if you think of like 700 years from today, that's like the 1400s English. That would be nearly incomprehensible to us today. So there is a reason why the language sounds a lot smoother, a lot more, it's not as like, if it sounds less old-timey, that's on purpose. That's all I'm saying.
I thought it was kind of, well, one of the things that I remember about reading it is that it was streamlined sort of because, say, and the Lord said you've been here long enough, you got to move on, type of thing. It's like the
Yeah.
impatience of get going, move to the new. But I guess typical of when you're telling a story. I mean, you get tired of telling it all the time, so you you kind of smooth it over and
Mhm.
make it more
Mhm.
interesting. Or make it fluid.
Mhm. So here's an interesting observation I have. Where does this, because the beginning is a recap, where does the recap start? Like at what point in the story of Israel? Because there's a distinction for this recap with some of the other recaps we've had.
Well, often it begins with the Lord brought you out of Egypt.
Right.
It doesn't talk about the beginning of the world. It doesn't talk about Abraham, does it?
Right.
Mhm.
This
Starts with-
recap starts with the people in the wilderness.
In the wilderness, yeah. Mhm.
This isn't the Lord brought you out of Egypt and then brought you to the wilderness. This starts with the giving
With the
of the
Lord.
law at Mount Horeb.
Mhm.
And I think that's a
Yeah.
key distinction to think about, because this book isn't written for the people escaping Egypt.
Yeah.
The beginning of the nation here in this book is the giving of the law at Mount Horeb.
Mhm.
Yeah, and when they do now and currently, I think when they do like the Passover Seder, they start early. I guess they start in Egypt when they talk about, let's say,
Yeah,
we were
because
slaves in Egypt and,
mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's because the Passover is fundamentally a story about
Right,
their
right.
time in Egypt. So how does it frame the book differently though, if it frames the story of the nation as starting with the giving of the law? How does that frame it differently than the story of the nation beginning with a group of people escaping exile? Yeah, Mary Ellen?
It's where your focus is.
Mhm.
If you start with the people leaving it, leaving Egypt, and the story of the wilderness, that's a 40-year story. And it becomes the focus of, them. And when you start with, what did you say the second one was, the law, maybe?
Yeah, so think of like the tablet, like Moses coming down the mountain with the tablets.
So then changing it, the focus to that, then you're talking about yourselves and your future. And it's whether you're looking back or you're looking forward.
Mhm. It also identifies the people slightly differently. Are they a group because they escaped together, or are they a group because God chose them together? And in the giving of the law and the tablets and kind of that whole situation where they make a covenant, they did the whole ritual with the sacrifices and they become a covenanted people. All of a sudden, they're not together because of happenstance. They are together because they chose to be there together. So the story of the people then is the choice to be God's people, not God's choosing of a group of people to hear their cries.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And of course, after the wilderness, everybody that refused to obey God's laws has died off.
Mhm.
So you're dealing with a different generation type of people.
Mhm. And what we will find in Deuteronomy is there's a point where the people re-covenant, where there is the covenant with the initial people who disobeyed, but in Deuteronomy, it's why Deuteronomy in the Greek is the second law giving. It's because Moses puts out the law again and basically says, do you agree to this? And it's the children that say yes. And so there's that second affirmation that they become a people when they basically sign the contract with God.
And that really is a different shift. That is a shift in this. So are we hoping that they will be more obedient to the law if they choose it. Because in the other story is that Moses is out of the picture for 5 minutes and they have a golden calf. I- Not 5 minutes, longer.
The way I'm kind of thinking about this is the difference between celebrating the anniversary, like if you think of a couple, you celebrate the anniversary of when you became a couple until you get married. And the moment that you sign the documents and you do that, your anniversary is the signing of the documents, and that other date kind of just falls
Okay.
away.
Mhm.
You have the situation of circumstance that brings you to a point, but there's the contract that tends to be the thing that actually makes a formal unit. And
Mhm.
that's kind of where you can think of this. I mean, it is used in the Christian portion of scripture where they talk about the Christians being the bride of Christ. In some ways, you can think of like Israel being married to God, but that happens when they sign the document for the covenant. The other part was just them dating. This is now that they're married.
Mhm.
I mean, it's also seen as why the God of Israel doesn't have a consort. Even though in the historical record, people do give this God a consort, it is seen that Israel is married to the God, not another goddess. So that's another way to think about it. So this represents the marriage. So when you talk about the marriage of these two, they talk about the nation, and the origin of the nation is the marriage license, not the dating. All right. Well, we have 10 minutes if you all have anything else for today, or we can just call it a day a little bit early and then
Very interesting to get going on this. It's a
mhm. So my question for you all is, I think I have like 3 or 4 days in Deuteronomy. We can spend more time in it if you all want it. That's or because it once again goes over the law again, are you all okay kind of doing the flyover quicker version of Deuteronomy?
Do you have a schedule prepared for?
I have one, but I made it months ago and I no longer trust that version of me.
Okay, I don't either.
Okay.
well,
Let me
what comes after Joshua?
Joshua and Judges, but notably Joshua, Judges, and then the First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings. That's actually what Deuteronomy is the introduction to. So you kind of can move through all of them. Yeah, Mary Ellen?
Well, your question is, do it in depth or skim, and since I don't know what's in the rest of the book, it's hard to choose. What if we choose to skim, but then if we hit something that we want to spend more time on, we can be flexible with the schedule and, maybe spend more time on that and, shift things back a week.
Okay. So how about we kind of go back to what we were doing at the beginning, where we can choose what we want to do next instead of me publishing a big calendar and then having to adjust it all the time. I can just make sure that the notes are updated with what we're gonna do the following week. Does that sound all right?
Sounds good to
Yeah,
me.
we do have to be certain we're all focused on the same area, though. So we know a week ahead of time, what have we got to read to prepare for next week?
That's
So
kind of
did everybody read 4 chapters? I didn't. I read 1.
that's okay. The first 4 chapters I wasn't going to ever have us talk through in depth. That I knew it was a recap, so I kind of wanted to move us along a little bit. Yeah, Mary Ellen?
When you're publishing what it is for next week, you mentioned putting it in the notes. I check back to the, yeah, I guess it's the email that comes on what's coming on Sunday, Live Worship Sunday. And it's the, whole kind of schematic. And then down on the bottom, there's the box that has the weekly schedule and the Zoom link down
Okay.
there. That's where I check to see what we're doing next.
But
Okay.
when does that appear on the internet?
Sunday morning.
I think it comes maybe Saturday or something. It comes to, it's kind
I
of an
don't
average.
see the assignment on the Sunday program. There's no assignments on the Sunday program. It's just the
The link. All right.
Zoom.
Let me give it some thought today. I have less going on today, so I can put a firmer schedule together. We're also getting to the point where I'm about to be, or there is no big thing coming up. And so I'm kind of reverting to my summer schedule if things are a little bit lighter. So I also need to plan out my vacation time. So let me see what let me take some more time with Deuteronomy than I did like 5 months ago. And I'll see how much of a schedule I can put together. And if we need to change, we can. Yeah, Larry?
Yeah, because next Tuesday is the 21st. I already have written in my calendar 2 different versions of what we're supposed to read. So,
Okay.
I'd like to know what am I supposed to read to get ready for next week as
Okay.
soon as possible. And you can't put it in the Tuesday thing because that doesn't, you can't
The
read
Tuesday thing is-
Tuesday afternoon as to what you should have read Tuesday morning.
No, that you do sometimes put the assignment in the Tuesday notes because you
The-
haven't written
The
them yet.
Tuesday notes should be what we're reading for next week.
Okay. Because
All
you
right,
write
but
that.
I will let me spend some time after we log off. I will bring clarity to you, Larry, so we have no confusion. I just purely need to spend some time with what I told you all to do a while ago and see if I actually like what I said.
Okay.
All
Sounds
right.
good. Sounds good.
All right. Take care.
Uh-huh.
Let me see.